From 1767, England's Board of Longitude published an annual nautical almanac. Inside were tables that explained the position of the sun, the moon, the stars, and even Jupiter and its moons. Who did all this computation? Who prepared this book? The computations were carried out by people back in a time when computers were not machines, but a person. It was a job description. You didn't require fantastic mathematical genius, but you needed to have basic arithmetic and to be able to follow simple steps that were laid out for you. Those steps are what we, computer programmers, would call an algorithm. Number crunching like this was a cottage industry. The almanac was put together by 34 separate people. And because people make mistakes, because people cheat, the computations were often sent to not one or two, but 3 different people, so the results could be compared. This is me, paraphrasing as best I can, page 84 from the wonderful book, The Information by James Gleick. And so that lets me say to you, welcome to this episode of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. Well, for centuries, well before the Board of Longitude and the Nautical Almanac became a thing, a universal idea was desperately trying to pop its head out. Francis Bacon saw this as early as 1605. He wrote, and I'm not going to do an accent because I've got no idea how people spoke in 1605. He said the following: any objects perceptive either to the eye or ear, provided only that those objects are capable of a twofold difference, as by bells, by trumpets, by lights and torches, by the report of muskets, and any instruments of like nature. What on earth is he talking about? Well, he mentioned a twofold difference. 0 and 1, true and false. Francis Bacon is talking about codes, the mapping of arbitrary symbols to messages that have meaning. And what he's saying is that by using a torch that can be on or off, messages can be transmitted at the speed, in the case of the torch, of light between 2 distances. So before computers came along and before zeros and ones became a thing, Francis Bacon had already started to glimpse how this could work. He, of course, wasn't the only person. Samuel Morse saw it, George Boole saw it, Charles Babbage saw it, and a man called Vannevar Bush saw it too. All of these different people, right across history, saw a part of a puzzle. That puzzle was not brought together until the visionary and the rebel and the subject of today's episode came along. Claude Shannon pieced together the puzzle, and it eluded humanity until that very point he got his hands on all the different pieces. So today's story is the story of Claude Shannon and the remarkable information theory that gave birth to the world we all live in today. It all started in many ways with Samuel Morse and his code. Morse code was as much about what was not sent as it was about what was sent. Okay, let me say that again. Or actually, let me give you an example. Bananas are yellow. I don't mention red, green or blue, and I don't mention oranges or apples. When I say bananas are yellow, the information in the message comes from what I do say and what I don't say. Let me give you a much more concrete example that will help this make sense. Samuel Morse and Alfred Vail, they worked out which dots and dashes to map to letters by going to the local printer. They inspected how often movable timepieces were replaced. They were doing a basic frequency analysis, and they came pretty close to working out which were the most common letters used in English. It turns out that the 2 most common letters are E and T. Now, E is a single dot in Morse code, and the T is a single dash. So when you're sending these very, very frequently used letters, E and T, it's what you don't send. You don't send 3 dots, you just send a single one, a dot and a dash. So when you transmit E and T, it's about what you don't send down the wire as much as it is about what you do send down the wire. This is an extremely important concept in information theory. Now, let's jump over to Lincolnshire. George Boole invented a system of algebra. You know, these Victorians, they had too much time on their hands, always inventing strange systems of algebra. Well, he didn't even have any numbers. There were no zeros, ones, twos, threes, or fours. Only two symbols, true and false. There were only three operators, and, or, and not. So no pluses, no divisions, no multiplications, simply and, or, and not. George Boole believed if the relevant facts of a situation were gathered together, then equations using his Boolean operators would produce intelligent answers. Smart people, Boole thought, would use his algebra to calculate intelligence in the same way that we already use normal algebra to calculate logarithms or celestial orbits. Once these Boolean equations or rules for intelligence were in place and created, a child, or maybe even something much simpler than a child, could follow them. Down in London, Charles Babbage was coming at this from a very different angle. He realised that numbers could be manufactured, like, for example, lace was manufactured in the then industrialising England. This sounds completely insane, doesn't it? How on earth do you manufacture a number? Well, we need to think about that for a second, because the manufacturing of lace was previously a cottage industry. Little pieces of lace went to different homes, and then they were brought back together to produce a final garment. This is exactly the way the nautical almanac was produced as a cottage industry. It was tedious, and it was repetitive, a little bit like the manufacturing of lace, and therefore it was completely ripe for automation. It was perfect for manufacture. So we now start to think about a very new idea, the large-scale manufacturing of numbers. What would that look like in real life? Well, of course, the large-scale manufacturing of numbers would lead to tables that were useful in the nautical almanac, useful as a logarithmic table, and useful for actuarial calculations. Charles Babbage only completed his machine in his imagination. It remained unbuilt in his lifetime, and of course, it receded from memory along with George Boole's system of logic. They were, momentarily, lost to time. The 1930s then roll around. We're in a different era now. Edison's lit up the world. The First World War is in the rearview mirror, but the tensions that will lead to the Second World War are impossible to ignore. Vannevar Bush is in charge of engineering at MIT. Many years later, Bush, in his role as the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, initiates the Manhattan Project. He would later appear in the film Oppenheimer by Christopher Nolan, played by Matthew Modine. Before he was famous, Vannevar Bush, back in the 1930s, came to a stunning conclusion. Rather than reasoning like a mathematician might, Vannevar Bush believed that reckoning through an iterative trial and error process using a computing machine could get to sensible answers quicker. In a world of pure maths, for example, a formula might tell you where to fire a shell to hit an enemy plane. But in the real world, full of wind resistance and zigzagging pilots desperate to stay alive, a machine working out when and at what angle to fire gets better results and faster, because by the time a human could have worked out the answer, the enemy plane would already be back at base. In Bush's view, any machine that did these sort of calculations embodied the equation. This was not a metaphor. It was literal. A rod or a ratchet in the machine would represent a variable. The turning of the ratchet would represent the passing of time. And at the end of these machines would be a wheel with a pen for plotting results. These types of mechanical machines solved two difficult problems. The first one was all about problems that you could write a formula down for, but the calculating of the results would have been utterly tedious. This is nautical almanac territory. Formulas existed, so too did a step-by-step process, but getting to a conclusion or to a result required hundreds or thousands of calculations for every single planetary position. Now, every year, the planets would shift, and of course, the calculations would then need doing again. That's what those 34 human computers were for. Obviously, men like Charles Babbage realised that pre-computing results and printing them in a book was more cost-effective than a mathematically illiterate population trying to work this stuff out on their own. The second set of problems are all about those problems that don't really have a formula. Vannevar Bush wanted to solve one of the most vexing mathematical challenges of the day, and it was a mathematical challenge that had real-world implications. How much electricity could surge across the grid and in between states before the grid exploded into a bunch of sparks? This was the sort of differential equation that would have been extremely difficult to solve by hand and extremely difficult to solve in time before the aforementioned grid exploded. Inside of Bush's differential analyzer, that's the machine he built at MIT, were rotating disks and gears that physically modelled the differential equations. This, again, was not a metaphor. It was literally a machine whose ratchets and gears were analogous to the differential equations it was meant to solve. Bush loved these real-world challenges, and he loved them because they combined, on the one hand, manual work, and on the other, abstract, difficult mathematical concept and challenges. In a way, then, the problems Bush looked at extended what Morse and Edison and Bell already realised. Firstly, computing was an extension of maths and science, so students had better be bloody well good with the slide rule and logarithms and multiplication and long division. But secondly, and this is interesting, isn't it? Computing was also an extension of shop. So students had to be equally good with wood and wire and soldering and pieces of rubber. What this meant was that computing was really difficult for people to understand and to categorise. It also explains why Sonny and Goodman, writing about Vannevar Bush in a wonderful book, Mind at Play, said that under Bush, computing or engineering was both head and handwork. It was a bizarre idea at the time, but Vannevar Bush understood this all too well. Norbert Wiener, a mathematician unburdened by the snobbery of his colleagues and a bit jealous since he had two left hands himself, said that Bush was one of the greatest apparatus men that America has ever seen, a man who thinks with his hands as well as his brain. These real-world problems, Bush's view of the world, are all what led to the beginning of that 1928 project to build the differential analyzer. It churned out in only 30 days a solution to the Earth's magnetic force's effect on cosmic rays. 30 days. No human would have ever attempted, let alone solved, that set of differential equations. When it did that, a machine solved a problem in physics that was hitherto impossible. Does that sound familiar? Well, maybe just a little bit. Demi Hassabis's AlphaFold, or DeepMind's AlphaFold, did exactly the same a century later when it solved the protein folding problem. There was no real intelligence in Bush's machine, and I'm afraid to say there's no real intelligence in AlphaFold either. But these computer systems work relentlessly, tirelessly, and quickly. That machine, though, had a problem, and that meant Vannevar Bush had a problem too. To reprogram a computer today, let's say to calculate pi to 1,000,000 decimal places instead of solving Fibonacci, I just have to type it into a new file. The differential analyzer, on the other hand, needed reconfiguration. Wheels came out, new wheels went in, rods came out, new wheels went in, and when the machine was rebuilt, it embodied a different set of equations. In a way, then, Vannevar Bush replaced tedious number crunching with tedious mechanics and even more tedious monitoring, as the damn thing went all the way through the night, and some poor students had to monitor it to make sure that the ratchets didn't get stuck. Its hypnotic wearing sent everybody half to sleep. Vannevar Bush knew that another machine was needed, but he also realised he needed somebody to look after his current analyzer, especially as it ran through the night. Vannevar Bush wrote an advert that appeared as a postcard on the bulletin boards of universities right across the United States, including over at the University in Michigan. In the 1920s, with Ted Vail's new AT&T not quite reaching out to the countryside yet, which was in any case always the last place to feel the benefits of the Industrial Revolution, a scrawny boy electrified the fence between his farm and the neighbours. Disrupting the direct current with dots and dashes let him speak to his friend on the next farm along. The place is Gaylord, Michigan, and the boy, having a mum as a teacher in common with Thomas Edison, who was his hero, is Claude Shannon. In 1930, now aged 14, Shannon won a wigwag competition at Scouts. The aim of wigwagging was to use your body and flags to signal Morse code. He could do that quicker than any other boy, given his experience on that homemade telegraph of his. Claude Shannon, like Edison before him and Robert Noyce after him, and like so many children growing up in the countryside or on the frontier, tinkered with radios, tinkered with gliders, tinkered with machinery, and in Claude Shannon's case, even tinkered with the neighbour's barn where he built an elevator. Shannon came of age in the time of the telegraph and the telephone. However, if the telephone made it as far as Gaylord, Michigan, likely it was no more sophisticated than a wire and a nail that was shared by a few farmsteads on the dreaded party line. But regardless, one way or another, codes, that's to say rules that associate symbols with messages, and the machinery for moving those messages around were all around Claude Shannon as a boy, in exactly the same way touchscreens are all around kids today as they come of age in the age of smartphones. This explains why, well before Mrs. Shannon brought Claude into the world, schools and colleges taught telegraphy and telephony. They needed to feed the ever-growing demands of the American economy, and they needed to feed the ever-growing demands of AT&T. Now, you sprinkle in a little bit of teenage or adolescence indecision, and you start to understand what happened next and why. Claude decided to follow a dual degree, maths and engineering. In this way, he formalised his interest in the utterly abstract world of numbers and codes and the utterly physical world of wire, wood, rubber, pieces of metal. His studies were, in other words, a formalisation, but importantly, a continuation of what he'd been doing his whole life, working with his hands and his head at the same time, with the results of both feeding into each other in a never-ending, iterative dance of hypotheses and experiment, of trial and of error. But that world where Claude could have his cake and eat it was surely going to come to an end, because before he knew it, his studies in maths and engineering started to come to its natural conclusion. Shannon now faced a question he'd avoided his whole life. What's he going to actually do? Will he become a mathematician and let go of engineering? Or will he do the opposite and become an engineer and let go of mathematics? The dual degree had been a wonderful way to postpone this decision, but he could postpone it no longer. And then all of a sudden, he was thrown a lifeline. A postcard arrived on the bulletin board. There was a part-time job working with machines at MIT. And the candidate, the lucky candidate, could also study for a master's degree in mathematics. Machines and maths, hands and heads. The debate was over. This is what Claude Shannon wanted him to do. The man offering him this escape route was none other than the Dean of Engineering at MIT, Vannevar Bush. 1936 arrives, and so too does Claude Shannon at MIT, armed with his dual degree from Michigan. The farm boy tinkerer enters the world of Vannevar Bush and his world of not thinking machines, but machines that did some pretty intelligent stuff. To get a real idea what was happening at MIT and the importance of the differential analyzer, we actually need to go back to when Bush was about 22. He created a device back then with two discs, one attached to a pen and the other that turned some paper around. Collectively, they measured the vertical and the horizontal distances of the terrain all around them. The machine, in other words, did the job of a land surveying team, which would usually take a few days to complete, not least because they had to convert their numerical data into drawings. Well, Bush's machine created a picture that was analogous to the mountains and the potholes it measured. This was, of course, in other words, a rudimentary analog computer. Within the guts of this neat machine was the genesis of the world-changing machine that Claude Shannon would get his hands on about 20 years later. The fun and games really began when Shannon peeked at the machine. Spinning discs, integrators and circuit-controlled relays that were just little switches, like the telegraph switch of his, except this time the switches were not closed and opened with the pressing of a finger, but by electromagnets. So what? So what? I know what you're thinking, so what? And maybe Claude Shannon thought, so what? Or maybe he'd have thought, so what, at any other time in his life. But you are not going to believe what had just happened to Claude Shannon. The very last thing he did at the University of Michigan was complete a course in Boolean logic. This is how wide Claude Shannon's interests were. Who follows a course in Boolean logic? Well, of course, the answer to that question is Claude Shannon. He's the type of person who would follow a course in Boolean logic. And then a memory started to stir. Shannon realised the switch in Vannevar Bush's machine, closed or open, was very much like binary. The binary system of George Boole's logic, except the difference, of course, in Boolean logic, the values were true or false. Old light bulbs, before Edison had the idea of winding that filament tight, were arranged in serial. What that meant was, if a light popped, the circuit was broken and all the lights went off. So that's what basically Christmas lights were like in the olden days. Thought Claude Shannon. That means then if two switches are arranged in serial and both the switches are pressed at the same time, the first switch and the second switch are pressed, that looks very much like a AND operation from George Boole's logic. If both of the switches are on, then the electricity will flow. And if one of them is open, the electricity will not flow. Well, all of a sudden, Claude Shannon started to think again. What about a circuit that was arranged in parallel? This is like modern Christmas lights. If one of the Christmas lights goes, the other ones remain lit. So if you imagine a number of switches in a row, one of them is on, or the other is on, or all of them are on, then the circuit will be completed and current will flow. If none of the switches are pressed, then current will not flow. And so Shannon realised that a machine made of switches embodied George Boole's AND and OR operations. Claude Shannon spent the rest of 1937 wondering what on earth all of that might mean. At the same time, though, over in New York, another man was coming to the same idea from a very different angle. Inside of Bell Labs, the enduring legacy of Ted Vail's vision and savvy, to say the very least, George Stiglitz's boss dumped a bit of homework on him. Could he, please, pretty please, simplify the company's electromechanical relays and, with Ted Vail's vision in mind, improve the whole damn system for not only everybody who works at Bell Labs, but for all the users of the phone system in the United States? Stiglitz, like Shannon, was not just an engineer, but a mathematical engineer, or an engineering mathematician if you prefer. Like Shannon, in the same year, Stiglitz took a look at what he was building and he was like, well, if a switch is on, that could be the binary number 1. And if it was off, the switch could represent the binary number 0. He grabbed a load of spare equipment and he built in his kitchen a device that added 2 binary digits together. He built, in other words, in machinery or in hardware, what Shannon was building in his imagination. Stiglitz became a little bit obsessed. Soon he had a machine that not only could do anything a desktop calculator could do, but he had something that a desktop calculator could never do. He had a machine that could press a button. Since the moment humanity realised a current could be sent down a wire, when, as well as the telegraph arriving in the imagination of our ancestors, so too did the idea of remotely detonating a bomb in an enemy's castle, Now, this is to say that ever since electrical technologies existed, humans dreamed of pressing switches for all kinds of reasons. Now, Stieglitz took this idea one step further. Conditions could be represented by numbers. This machine of his could press a button or press a switch when certain conditions were met. Well, if it could do that, then it could decide. No matter how rudimentary, Stieglitz's machine embodied a sense of mind. This one idea skewers the notion that computers are just calculators. Then it happens, the thesis. Back in Boston, in MIT, stewing on his ideas for most of that year, Shannon got busy creating what in time, but not at the time, became known as arguably the most influential master's thesis of the 20th century. That's Waldrop, by the way. A symbolic analysis of relay and switching circuits was the title of this master's thesis. It was the product of all of Claude Shannon's experiences, from the farm and the Morse code all the way to Boolean logic at the University of Michigan. Once all of that was filtered through Vannevar Bush's differential analyzer, it led Shannon to a series of stunning points. First of all, like Stieglitz, he'd made the link between true and false, on and off, and by the time the paper was out, the numbers 0 and 1. That's to say, an open switch was a 0, a closed switch was a 1. Like Boolean logic, binary was arcane, and number systems for sure, but a pretty useless one. But it did mean that binary numbers, they could be used to represent decimal numbers, could be used to create computing machines. Secondly, once Shannon made the link between numbers and switches, bearing in mind that if one switch was closed and the second was closed, then the circuit would flow or would not flow. So George Boole's AND gate, once it was associated with that word, then implies decision-making in the form of if-then statements. Shannon then showed in that master's paper something similar to Stieglitz, that switches could be manipulated to find the combination of a lock, and then if the machine was attached to a lever or a finger that pressed a button, the lock could then be unlocked. So like Stieglitz's machine, this showed that switching machines could not just calculate, but decide and then act. They were thus embodied with mind, and if you stick a robotic hand on them, a little piece of autonomy. Thirdly, Shannon came to the same conclusion as Bacon. The medium did not matter. This is an important insight. Switches could be on or off, like torches could be lit or snuffed out, or a bell could be ringing or not ringing. But Shannon didn't go backwards in time or bigger in scale. He went the other way. If a switch could be implemented at the biological level, then a molecular computer could be made to do maths, to flick switches, and potentially to think. All Shannon or future engineers would have to do is capture intelligence as Boolean equations and then, possibly through a manufacturing process, print or punch out intelligent machines. Vannevar Bush's influence went on to help Shannon snag the Alfred Nobel Prize. Please note that this is not the same as the Alfred Nobel Prize that is awarded from Norway, but it is instead a similarly named prize that's awarded by the American Society of Civil Engineers to engineers. It's got nothing to do with the actual Nobel Prize. But nevertheless, a little feather in the cap for Claude Shannon. But there was a massive problem. The problem for Shannon, to put it simply, is that digital was old hat, antiquated, associated with that snowflake Samuel Morse, associated with accounting machines that read punch cards and thus made them really no more sophisticated than those ancient looms and fairground organs. Claude Shannon's observations no doubt pointed to a first-class mind. But Shannon couldn't see any applications for these technologies, and neither could Vannevar Bush. The present and the future belong to analog, and besides, digital and binary technologies were just so regressive. Now, Shannon didn't know this at the time, but his idol, Thomas Edison, was also a distant cousin. They had both descended from a Mr. John Ogden, a stonemason who arrived from Lancashire in America and built New York's first churches. He literally laid the foundation for the city and the country. A couple of centuries later, Thomas Edison did something similar, laid the foundation for the electrification of the United States and then thereafter the world. Claude Shannon had it within him to lay his own foundation. But this was not going to be the moment. That would have to wait. In the meantime, Vannevar Bush, very aware of the mercurial talent he had on his hands, wanted Shannon to stay at MIT. What could he do? What could he do a PhD in? Genetics? Vannevar Bush figured this queer logic of Mendelian inheritance. Mendel was the guy who figured out that peas had regressive traits, so sometimes a pea looked like their grandfather pea but didn't look like their parents. This was before the genetic code was cracked, of course, before Francis Crick and Watson had done their job. But Vannevar Bush realised that there was something about genetics and switches, something about the binary nature of how a gene is expressed or not expressed in reaction to the environment. He figured Claude Shannon understood this queer Mendelian switching mechanism. There was another thing, though. Vannevar Bush hated premature specialisation. He didn't want another hyper-focused student. He wanted the next Leonardo da Vinci. So once again, you see the hand of Vannevar Bush shaping Claude Shannon, and by doing so, shaping the world that was yet to come. During his work into genetics, something changed in Claude Shannon. A step had been taken, invisible to us, maybe even invisible to him. But Vannevar Bush had placed an extra experience in Shannon's mind, and then it stewed and it percolated. And then, in a neat moment of symmetry, the place where Stibitz worked, they came a-calling. In 1941, Shannon eventually left MIT and joined Bell Labs in New York. Although a paragon of innovation, AT&T was certainly not a paragon of virtue. Its deeply anti-Semitic ancestry really only started to unroll in that year, 1941, when Claude Shannon arrived. Bell Labs realised it was probably better to include men like Richard Feynman and not let him go, not least because during the war, Bell Labs were meant to be fighting fascists and anti-Semites, and not directly or indirectly supporting that cause. You have to remember, listener, that in 1941, AT&T's PR machine had not yet completed their job. And so into Bell Labs, Jews, women, and Claude Shannon enter all at the same time. They all found themselves in a place where budgets, for practical purposes, were essentially infinite. Intellectually, anything went at Bell Labs. And this is when it all genuinely started to come together. For Claude Shannon, his work in the war into cryptography, he had helped set up a telephone line between Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, his recent dalliance with genetics, and his new experiences that he would pick up within the highly creative walls of Bell Labs started to enter into his consciousness and started to add to all the other ideas that he was at that moment synthesizing. And so now we pick up the story starting with a Swede, Harry Nyquist. Nyquist invented arguably the very first fax machine, from the Latin facsimile, to make alike. Although, to be fair, Thomas Edison prototyped a fax machine in order to send Chinese characters because they didn't lend themselves to Morse code. That is a different story. Nevertheless, Harry Nyquist tried to send a photograph over a telephone wire, and he did this by breaking the image into chunks and then sending those chunks down the wire with a signal that was analogous to their brightness. So in much the same way that an electrical signal was analogous to the voice that went into a phone call, Nyquist sent signals that were analogous to the brightness of an element of a picture that could later be reconstructed into the whole picture. This got him thinking about the band of frequencies, or what we might call the bandwidth. The greater the bandwidth of a communication channel, the more of the photograph could be sent over the wire. And this was the genius of Nyquist's observation. If the signal went in chunks, it didn't really matter what happened on the other end, as long as those chunks could be reconstructed. And so for the very first time, we are thinking about discontinuous signals. A little bit like dots and dashes on Morse's code. Dot, dot, dot. It's discontinuous. It's not a continuous analog signal like a telephone call would be. Instead of dots and dashes, we now see chunks of data being sent down a wire. Very importantly, Nyquist goes one step further. He starts to think of information in mathematical terms, and specifically he cooks up the formula W equals K log M, where M is the number of potential values that can be sent. In a circuit, as Claude Shannon had already shown us, there are only two values in any alphabet: 0, 1, on, off, true, false. This is a big issue because the bigger the set of values, the more information can be sent. So, for example, the words I'm speaking to you right now, I'm using, of course, the alphabet, 26 characters, and all the words that can be made up from them. But if I was to switch to a smaller alphabet, to zeros and ones, and started to speak to you again, it would take me hours, no, not hours, days and weeks to broadcast this podcast. I've turned into a robot from the year 2027. 1 0 1 1 0 1 1 0 0 1 1 0 0 0 0 1. Right, okay, I'm going to stop. What did I just send you? Well, I actually started to spell out the word visionaries. I didn't even get to the end of the word. This is Nyquist's observation. The greater the alphabet, the more can be sent. But of course, the other part of his equation was about bandwidth. The greater the bandwidth, the more can be sent as well. Therefore, potentially you could get away with a small alphabet containing just zeros and ones if and only if the bandwidth was wide enough. Nyquist has now left us with an idea that is the central theme of this podcast and the book, Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. Most communication systems are sort of like the telegraph. And what do I mean by that? I mean that most systems are about the arbitrary mapping of symbols to messages. When a human's involved, those messages mean something to the recipient and the sender. But we also have an extra idea about bandwidth. What if you wanted to double the capacity of a telegraph wire? You would simply add an extra wire and therefore double the capacity instantly. So we're skating around the edges of something. How much bandwidth you have, the size of the alphabet, and how much information, you remember the yellow bananas, we do not send. The final piece of the puzzle came together in 1928. Ralph Hartley had a huge impact on Claude Shannon's thinking, as big an impact as George Boole. What did he figure out? What Hartley realised? Well, information's a funny thing, isn't it? And a bit paradoxical. It's always physical. Paintings on caves, indentations on bits of tinfoil in the case of Thomas Edison's phonograph, images beamed to television screens, stored on DVDs or stored on celluloid. Then, of course, you get to DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. My goodness, that's a mouthful. There, you've got sugar bases storing information. So it is physical. There can be nothing more physical than information. And yet, why is it so transformable? Because it somehow exists outside of the medium. Francis Bacon had already figured this out. A trumpet or a torch or a musket being fired into the air could be a 0 or could be a 1, could be on or off. And thus you see information in a very, very peculiar light. Hartley took all of this one step further. He was also thinking about pictures. Imagine a rich, colourful picture broken into what Hartley called elementary areas. We'd call them pixels. Now, in a picture that's brightly coloured, there's lots of information. But imagine, if you will, I'm stood in the centre of that picture and I've got a black t-shirt on. In other words, in the middle of that picture, there is a square box of black. Now, it could be made up of thousands or even millions of pixels. Do I need to send all those pixels to you? Well, certainly if I was drawing the picture in my living room, I would be drawing all the pixels out fully. But this is what Hartley realised. You don't need to send all the pixels that make up the black square of my t-shirt. You just need to send 2 tiny pieces of information. Where do the pixels begin? Where do the pixels end? Importantly, how many pixels are between those 2 coordinates? With those pieces of information, and of course an understanding between the sender and the recipient, that image can be reconstructed in true fidelity without actually sending that information. So we are now at the point where we're talking again about the message and what's not inside of it. We are talking about the concept of redundancy, what can safely be left out. So now you feel it, right? Shannon is almost there. He was close. What is the one thing that we know? Information transforms. The same movie can be projected onto a cinema screen, broadcast as a television signal, stored on a video cassette, or burnt onto a DVD. Different physical forms, same information. Information survives transformation. This means we are nearly there in the same way that Claude Shannon was nearly there. Because of Nyquist and because of Hartley, we have a mathematical understanding of the relationship between bandwidth and alphabet size. We understand that if we send something, there has to be some sort of agreement in advance so the receiver can reconstruct with fidelity parts of the message that were not sent. All of Shannon's experiences and all of the work of those who came before him collides in his mind, and in 1948, the bomb is dropped. Published in the Bell Systems Technical Journal as a mathematical theory of communication, Shannon does it. And it's remarkable in its simplicity. There are only 6 things, Shannon says, in communication. Number 1, a source that sends the message. Number 2, a transmitter that changes it into a signal. Number 3, a channel, like Morse's wire between Washington and Baltimore. A source of noise that mucks up the signal. A receiver that decodes the signal back into the message. And finally, the destination. Now, sometimes the destination is a person. Right now, I'm a sender. My messages, my information is transformed by the microphone into zeros and ones and sent to you. However, you might also be another computer, an artificial intelligence that is scanning the transcript that has been produced by probably another computer. So the recipient and the sender are often humans, but not always. Shannon's model holds in other places as well. What about DNA? Well, that's the source of the information. It unrolls into RNA. That's the transmitter. And eventually, through the communication process, it becomes a string of amino acids where it arrives at its destination. That would be the human body in our case. Shannon, of course, does not stop with the model. He continues the work of Nyquist and he completes the formula that explains how much information can be sent down a channel at any given moment. He then brings in the idea of entropy from physics. And finally, the coup de grace, the icing on the cake. No, the cherry on the icing on the cake. In exactly the same way that J.J. Thomson discovered and named the electron, which is the principal unit of electricity, Shannon discovers and names the principal unit of information, the binary digit. We call it the bit. 0 or 1, true or false. Every single piece of information can be reduced to zeros and ones. Arbitrary codes that are mapped to messages with meanings hold for sound, vision, letters, you name it. The binary digit. Did it work? Well, what does a good theory do? It explains the past and it predicts the future. With the binary digit, we finally had a scientific understanding of what Francis Bacon was doing with his trumpets, what Samuel Morse was doing with his dot and dash, and we had a prediction of all future communication and computing devices. We are almost at the end of this journey, or are we? Claude Shannon had a massive problem. His work was about switches. All of the work was about switches. And machines made from switches were just too big. Analog technology still dominated. That's radio, television, long-distance phone calls. But as the war came to a conclusion, a genuine need for a digital and binary computer arose. Enemy forces, of course, kept innovating with their aeroplanes and rockets. Gunners defending cities like London needed updated firing tables. A firing table explained, very much like the nautical almanac, where to point a gun and at what angle and when to pull the trigger so that the shell would, fingers crossed, arrive at the same point at the same moment in time as the enemy plane. Well, because of the constant innovations, all the mathematicians with their pencils and their papers could not keep up. This led to the design of a digital and binary computing machine called the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, ENIAC. By the time it was finished, though, the war was over. But it was impressive. It could calculate quickly. It didn't make too many mistakes. But unfortunately, it was expensive and it was massive. It weighed 70 tons. So presently, a computer sits in your back pocket. But back then, a person could sit in a computer. In fact, hundreds of people could sit inside of ENIAC. Shannon realized that anything made from switches, any computing device made from switches, needed to be much smaller if it was ever going to be practical or affordable. Luckily for Shannon, in another part of the same building at Bell Labs, Walter Brattain, William Shockley, and John Bardeen were working on something very interesting. They produced the world's first electronic component made from a semiconductor. It later picked up the name transistor. It could do three things. It could rectify a current, it could amplify a signal, and it could act as a very fast switch. In other words, the transistor did exactly what the vacuum tube already did, but was much smaller, much more resilient, and had much lower power needs. Boom! Everything for the future of computing was all of a sudden there, and it had all been created in the same building. We had a theoretical architecture for computers, for compression. We had an idea of circuit design. If you could follow George Boole's logic, you could design a circuit on a bit of paper, and then later it could be manufactured at scale. All of that would shrink down Shannon's switches from the size of a machine as big as a house, potentially to the size of a machine that could, I don't know, sit under your desk and maybe one day sit in your pocket. And of course, that is where we find ourselves today. Every modern technology, with the exception of radar, probably is on your smartphone. Computers, GPS, digital transmitters, digital receivers, right there in your pocket because of the breakthroughs in information theory and because of the hardware breakthrough with Bardeen and Shockley and Brattain in a different part of Bell Labs. Claude Shannon had done it. The pieces and the fragments of the puzzle were all across history. Francis Bacon got close. Samuel Morse made a contribution. George Boole came at it from a completely different angle. Then, of course, you have Nyquist and Hartley and Vannevar Bush himself, who, of course, gave Shannon the space and the encouragement to percolate these ideas, which eventually popped out as information theory. And you know it's a good theory because it explained the past and it predicted the future. So Claude Shannon, the farm boy from Gaylord, Michigan, who started life tinkering with the telegraph, ended up in the first instance giving us the most important master's thesis ever written, and not long after that, information theory. It is now 1956. Brattain, Bardeen and Shockley are in Stockholm preparing to receive the Nobel Prize for their invention of the transistor. They could not have known, they could not have imagined that one day soon their device, In fact, the whole world economy would lay in the hands of a traumatized, partially deaf but handsome one-time survivor of Hitler's Third Reich and two-time survivor of Russia's Red Army. He was presently sailing past the white cliffs of Dover in the hull of the General William G. Hahn. He was bound for America, for that mighty woman whose torch glows worldwide. The mother of exiles would soon cry out, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And so Europe obliged and gave unto Lady Liberty the greatest American that had ever lived. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Visionaries, Rebels and Machines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people to discover the show, and of course, we'd like a few more listeners. To find out more about me, the work I do, or to buy a copy of the book, please visit the website. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.